We have also with us Professor Stefani Donald. He is the who's a distinguished professor of film in the College of Arts. She leads research and impact activities in Leeds of the International Justice, Arts and Migration Networks. She served as a chairperson of the Australian Research Council panel, and she also served on the 2012 HCA Excellence of Research panel in Australia. So I invite Professor Stefani. Please, Professor Stefani, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I'm just unmuting.
Yes, please start your talk.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, please be brief, 7 to 10 minutes, please.
Yes, of course, I'll start.
Yeah.
So I was asked to talk about the UK and its response to COVID-19 and the way in which it's impacting on migrants and refugees. So I'm going to do that with 3 critical perspectives and then think about 3 test cases very briefly. So I think I don't think these are critical perspectives exactly, but the way, perhaps the lenses of looking at this. One way is realizing that this crisis has created a really strong sense of fault lines in society becoming visible. It's a visibility of crisis, we might call it. And some of those fault lines are very deep in British history. It's the hangover of colonialism and imperialism. It's also the hangover of much more recent historical events, such as the 2008 crash and world global crash, and the British response to that, which was austerity, which completely undermined health and social services across the country, amongst other kinds of creations of poverty, very, very deep pockets of poverty in the country. I think the other fault lines that it's produced, or rather other perspective, is that they are what these historical misunderstandings, the misunderstanding of itself that is a factor of the British, if you like, historical constitution, is a deep misunderstanding of its own place in the world, is that it doesn't know how to find good benchmarks or zero sums for its behaviors, its policies. So there is a absolutely frenetic return to the Second World War at the moment, as though somehow COVID-19 is a European war, which it isn't. COVID-19 is a virus, it's a pandemic, and it's actually quite frightening to see how sort of strange the mismatch is between Britain, that thinks of itself as this global force when arguably it really isn't anymore, but at the same time, Britain that will not look in time at what is happening globally and understand that it will also impact this small island. And I've got a quote from you just to bring that. This is from Dr. Amitava Banerjee, who is a cardiologist consultant. And he said yesterday, we were not humble enough to look at other countries, China, Italy, or Spain, and learn a lesson from them and lock down quickly. It's as simple as that. So for Dr. Banerjee, you know, a very eminent cardiologist who's at the front line of this pandemic, it was about a lack of humility in the British psyche. That's really been at the base of a lot of the problems that we are now looking at. Another doctor put it in a more, if you like, practical way, which was the result, if you like, of this lack of humility. She said it's lack of testing, it's failure to shut down society in time, and it's a lack of care equipment. And all of those problems have, if arguably, come on from both the strategies of austerity over the last 10 years, but I would also argue that it's also metaphorical in the sense that a lack of care equipment is because, and this gets to the point about the migrant situation, is that there is a lack of care, not just for migrants who are coming into the country in the last, now, but people of migrant background, which goes back to the conversation at the beginning of today's talk, where I think it was Dr. Kadria mentioned this idea that, you know, at what point do you become or stop being a migrant? Is it when your family have been in a place for 3 generations or 10 generations or 1 generation? Who's a migrant? And I think the answer is you're a migrant if the host society says you are. So my background is Dutch, Irish, Scottish, English. I can walk around the UK and not be seen as a migrant, but actually I'm as much of a migrant as many other people. I'm also Australian. I am also a migrant, but I don't get seen as one. And that's a feature of the colour of my skin, quite frankly, and the tone of my voice. But, you know, it's not who is a migrant decided by the migrant, which again goes right back to the beginning. It's decided by the host society and its biases. The 3 test cases quickly, migrants in detention and what are called FON, foreign overseas nationals in detention. This was a really worrying situation because nearly 1,000 people were held in detention forced, sorry, what's the word? Can't think of the word when you're returned. Anyway, forced return. Test cases have been brought, and the judiciary have decided that most people should be released into the community as a safer place to be during COVID-19 than in a detention facility. But it's noticeable that the judiciary and NGOs that work for people in detention had to fight quite hard and are still fighting with the Home Office on this issue. So there's been a big gap between the judiciary and government on that. And it does bring into it, and the nature of the fight that if you're only in detention because you're meant to be being deported, if you can't be deported, you shouldn't be in detention. And yet the Home Office wanted to go against their own logic in order to keep people in detention. So there was something more fundamental about the anti-migrant sensibility in the Home Office than simply people who are about to be deported, because they're not about to be deported because they can't be, because there's nowhere for them to go home to in many cases. Another test case are small populations. So I'm working with British Chinese researchers thinking about how completely the British Chinese population has not been thought about in any way, as far as one can understand, in terms of language, access to healthcare, in terms of what might happen to the, if you like, the bulge of the 30–40% of British Chinese people who are the 25 to 35-year-old professionals. Will there be a brain drain? Will they decide to forget Britain and to leave? Because a lot of them are very highly motivated and highly educated people who would be welcomed elsewhere. So that's another thing, kind of consideration about, you know, very high skilled migrants who are not migrants and that they're British, but who could be considered migrants by themselves, actually, if they know that they have the skills and the the capacity to re-migrate, maybe after 4 or 5 generations. And then the key 2 groups, of course, that have been more considered in the British news world, the news cycles, but only too late, has been the people on the front line in health provision, many of whom are doctors, nurses, all sorts of care workers, many of whom are people of Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups, and many of whom have been dying disproportionately from COVID-19. The most recent figures suggested that a Black man in Britain is 4 times as likely to die of COVID-19 if he contracts it as a white man. So this, they've tried to look at that data in relationship to all sorts of factors, including people's viral load. And they haven't really worked it out yet, but there is something going on there about inequality, even for people in the higher professional ranks. There is some major deep problem in British society that is causing this. The second group, and this is another issue of huge invisibility, because British Chinese invisible in the general conversation in Britain about anything. Migrants in detention made to be invisible by put in detention centres where they cannot be seen. The whole question of the amazing over-representation of BAME professionals. I mean, it's a great over-representation in the sense that there are so many talented doctors and nurses willing to work in British hospitals, but that was just not a known thing until people started dying in such great numbers. And then in the care homes, where old people are arguably and have arguably been allowed to die by British government policies, and it's again only in the last few days that there's been an acknowledgement that their policies allowed these people to die, and their carers, many of whom again are first generation migrants in this case, often people, women, usually women, but not always, from, you know, who've only been in the country recently because it's not very well paid. It's not the greatest of jobs, perhaps, but these people have found themselves moved from being described as low skill, unwelcome migrants by Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, just a few weeks before COVID, to now realizing, the country realizing that they're key workers, and again, key workers who are extremely vulnerable to infection. So that's the situation, which I can't really give you any predictions of what this will lead to, but I do think it has really opened up the really darker sort of fissures in the way British society thinks about itself. It shows that it has a really poor understanding of itself historically, and it makes decisions based on that poor understanding. So at all levels, but perhaps particularly at the current government level. So that's it. It's not a nice story. We've got over 30 million dead as of yesterday. So we're the second highest death rate in the world. Brazil will probably catch up. That's where we are.
Please wrap up. Please wrap up.
I'm finished. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. I hope Afani has finished up. Okay, thank you very much for this. And we have this racial angle now, which is really coming up very majorly in this whole discussion. Now